Hi, I'm Tyler Harris, and you're listening to the Nebraska Notebook. This time we're visiting with Nathan Mueller, Extension Cropping Systems Educator in Dodge and Washington counties. And yesterday, Nathan hosted a wheat field day at a plot in Washington County. And as I understand it, it was the first time in, I think, about 35 years that there has been a wheat plot tour north of the Platte River in eastern Nebraska. So to follow up with that, today we're going to be talking about winter wheat and some of the reasons growers might consider growing it in this part of the state. So, Nathan, when we consider market value of winter wheat, especially the extremely low basis we saw across the Great Plains last year, is that kind of a roadblock for some growers in Nebraska?
I think here in the eastern 1/3, kind of the tiers of counties along Iowa, it is hard for wheat profitability-wise if you just look at the price of wheat and basis, even though the basis is actually pretty good here in Fremont for winter wheat. It's hard to pencil it out there, so there's a lot of ways to add additional revenue, and then there's a lot of benefits that often we don't think about why some small acreages of winter wheat on our farms might be helpful. So that was kind of the point of getting the variety trial back north of the Platte River again, which we haven't had for 35 years, was to show that where wheat might fit on people's farm operations still.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, we're not talking about taking half of your farm operation and seeding it to wheat. So it's
no.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up. And of course, we look at yesterday's plot tour, and there was a pretty sizable crowd there. Not just people from Nebraska, but I think even a couple people from Iowa. So there's definitely an interest right now. And as we've talked about before, there are definitely reasons to grow winter wheat outside of the market value. And one of those that was discussed yesterday was the flexibility to apply manure at a time when there's less potential for soil compaction. Is that right?
Yeah, so, Costco is going to be located in Fremont, so besides our current swine operation and cattle feedlot and dairy production in Dodge and Washington County, we'll have poultry. So, the biggest concern we have when we have a lot of manure that we need to get land applied is if we would have a wet fall followed by a wet spring and you're having it maybe commercially applied for you. The amount of days might become a barrier to actually trying to be on those fields when they're not wet. And so obviously growing wheat, maybe it might be a 20 or 30 acre field of winter wheat. We're pretty confident in Nebraska that we're going to have some dry soils to drive on in July, August, and September. And that can be worth a lot in terms of having a little bit more flexibility in our manure management plans.
Well, yeah, and it's, like you mentioned, also a good way to spread out your workflow.
Yeah.
So there's a big benefit from that standpoint, just on the manure side, but you're also spreading out your workflow just from a management standpoint in general. So
correct. Yeah, and one of the producers who attended the meeting last night had already told me this year, it was fairly challenging to get corn and soybeans in this area. We had an extremely wet period from mid-April to mid-May, and he said it was 30 less acres of corn he had to try to squeeze in between rainfall events. So it was worth something to him to kind of shift some of that workload and stress to another part of the year when maybe that workload shifted into July where he can move that workload to July when he's harvesting wheat.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a pretty big burden to lift off your shoulders when you're kind of racing to the finish there in the springtime. So, and then there are the soil health benefits too, and that was something we've talked about, but it's something we probably can't talk about enough, I think. And one of the biggest of those would be the reduced risk of soil erosion, right, during some of those high-risk months in the spring when we typically get a lot of rainfall. And I'm sure you've probably heard from a lot of producers that will tell you that there is a lot of erosion that doesn't occur just by having that nice thick stand of wheat there during those months in the spring, in addition to some of the improved soil structure and infiltration.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, our biggest rainfall months are kind of April, May, and June, and we get a lot of those heavy rainfall events in May and June. And that's also the time when our fields corn and soybean fields have the least amount of residue cover, which before that crop is really provides much canopy or protection from erosion. And we know over the long run, soil erosion really has hurt us. We can still see it in our yield monitor data every fall, what happened 60, 70, 80 years ago. So, and twofold, we talked about manure helping with soil quality, infiltration, soil structure, and then we're adding wheat on top of that. And that fibrous root system near the surface, over the long run, they've shown really does help with soil aggregation, which is going to help again with soil structure and infiltration. And so, and again, growing more months of the year, having a living root system is really going to help microbial activity and health as well. So between manure and wheat, I think those two stacked on top of each other really provide us a lot of benefit.
Absolutely. And even on top of that, then, and this is something that, we've heard about time and again, especially north of I-70, where we have some challenges with early establishment of certain cover crops that aren't quite as winter hardy. Wheat allows us a little bit of a wider window to get some of those established, and then we can capture some added value by grazing that biomass when we couldn't, just if we had waited until after corn harvest, for example, and planted cereal rye.
Yes, exactly. And we know we're going to catch some rains in probably July and certainly in August. So when we get that cover crop seeded after in this area, after probably the first or second week of July when we harvest wheat, it's an opportunity to get a cover crop started early. And then you're going to have the tonnage out there and be worth the effort to get cattle turned out. And so, if people that have cattle, having that planting a cover crop after winter wheat is one of the additional ways to add extra profitability to those acres. And the other one that the current grower that held the variety trials, Greg, he's interested in the wheat straw from the bedding standpoint for sows. So he's looking at it and a place to haul manure. So it's really all those added profits and benefits that wheat creates some flexibility. And like I said, we're not expecting to see a lot of acres of winter wheat, but I really think a lot of growers would stand to benefit from a 30, 40 acres of winter wheat a year.
Well, and it's also just that, like you mentioned, Nathan, that fitting it into the rotation. That's one of the big things. And in visiting with some of the producers that attended last night, one of the questions that some of the other extension educators that were there would talk about, what's your plan for winter wheat and including it in the rotation? And I think that's a prime example that you gave, because that's how we know it fits our system, is if we have this manure that we can apply back on it, and we know we can capture this value by harvesting the straw from it to use for bedding. We know, too, on the rotation side, that's another thing I wanted to follow up on, because, we know we don't usually want to plant wheat following corn. We don't want to follow corn with wheat, right? Because of some of the disease potential like Fusarium head blight. When it comes to that rotation consideration, especially considering I think there's been some research showing a yield boost from soybeans following winter wheat, what are some of the things we want to consider for growers who are thinking about planting winter wheat and fitting it into their rotation?
Yeah, I think that the first question, like we brought at the very beginning, was profitability, and am I going to lose money growing winter wheat? And I had the same discussions with farmers in South Dakota when I worked there. When we look at rotations in the Midwest, having 2 years of another crop besides soybeans in that rotation, so that may be a corn soybean, or in this case a corn soybean winter wheat. By having 2 years between that soybean crop, we're seeing about a 3 to 4 bushel yield advantage in kind of regional research. So, but you got to remember that 3 or 4 bushels you're gaining is really money that wheat crop made you. So you can't leave that extra $20, $30 on as money your soybean crop made you. That money needs to be moved back on your balance sheet to what your wheat made you. And the same thing if for example, if we were to have a dry fall and a dry spring, dryland corn, rain-fed corn in this area might stand to benefit too in that possible climate scenario, weather scenario as well. So for sure the soybeans, but in dry falls and springs following winter wheat, there might be some real advantages there, rain-fed corn in that as well.
And then when we look at a situation too, we see that there's a potential benefit for soybeans after winter wheat. What's an example, I guess, of a good way to fit that into the rotation, to fit winter wheat into the rotation, if we want to avoid wheat following corn?
Yeah. So the easiest in this area One, from the standpoint of time frame of getting the wheat in a timely fashion, that has a lot to do with the yield potential. Typically, soybeans, we can start to harvest soybeans the first week of October, where corn is towards the end of October. So we've done regional research. I looked at the first trials, and I presented at the Cover Crop Conference as well, showing that, those 2.7, those early maturing varieties, all the way down to 2.4, 2.6, are yielding just as well as their full season beans in northeast Nebraska. So I think there's a real advantage to spreading out our soybean harvest to allow us to get some wheat planted at the beginning of October, and then that's really the ideal place in the rotation, is planting wheat after soybeans. So we don't have to worry about, one, less residue of planting no-till wheat into corn stalks, but planting no-till wheat into soybean stubble works really well, and it gets us at the time window we really want to plant, and then we're really reducing our risk of fusarium head blight, which is probably the main concern of wheat following corn. So really the ideal rotation is going to be corn, soybean, winter wheat in that rotation.
Okay, and that also probably gives us a little bit of a nitrogen credit, I would imagine, too, which is, one of the things that I know wheat producers have wrestled with in the last the last year, just because prices are not so great, and some have held off on some of those nitrogen applications that maybe would have benefited their protein levels to a certain extent. So in the long run, I think it sounds like, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but that sounds like something that could benefit everybody, the producer, so they aren't getting docked at the elevator for having some of those lower protein levels, and the end user, having that higher protein content for the end user.
Yeah, growing winter wheat in northeast Nebraska, just because it hasn't been grown for a while, and I think Steve Benzinger highlighted this. He hadn't seen some of his experimental varieties grown in the conditions we saw last night, where we've had ample rainfall moisture. The wheat, even the SY Wolf, which was kind of the reference of what the growers was 40-41 inches tall, and that's about as tall as we'd expect to ever see it. So we've had ideal growing conditions last year, and the growers saw 100 bushel wheat. I think we have the potential for 90 bushel wheat. We'll see what the hot weather does here this coming weekend, but I think that's something people don't realize is, it is possible under good weather years to see 100 bushel wheat. A lot of times we think about the wheat yields that we used to get 30, 40 years ago, when the last time some guys had grown wheat. So there is the yield potential there. The main thing that we got to strive for here in the eastern third of Nebraska is nitrogen management, to make sure we do have enough nitrogen so we don't have protein problems when we do get those high yields. And then the second thing is diseases, and Stephen Wagulo talked about that quite a bit, from whether it's stripe rust, leaf rust, fusarium head blight, or a whole host of other diseases. In the higher humidity, high rainfall area where we have 30 inches of rainfall here, managing those diseases is critical, and that was a question that came up several times.
Oh, absolutely, and that's a big that, and probably the nitrogen use efficiency component are huge factors in variety selection, which were talked about last night, and will be continued to be talked about here as our wheat plot tours throughout the state over the next month. And one of the benefits too, if we go back to that diversified rotation, this is something I forgot to bring up, is that when you have that diversified rotation, it's forcing you to think differently and mix up your herbicide program. Yep. So that's, in addition to the benefits that you get from a crop that's putting on all this biomass earlier on and choking out some of those earlier season weeds, you're also mixing up your herbicide program then. Yes,
from diversified mode of action, but just like you mentioned on winter wheat, just the sheer volume of biomass. One of the biggest, I'd say the biggest three weed concerns we have here in kind of east central Nebraska is mare's tail, which is a native weed, but a winter annual. And just the fact of growing winter wheat really helps us cut down on our herbicide costs and challenges in getting that controlled in the spring ahead of corn and soybeans. The other two are water hemp and Palmer amaranth. Again, they're late emerging. Unlike mare's tail, they're late emerging, come up in June, but that's when we got a nice plush winter wheat crop. And it's a lot easier to deal with those and not have the struggle to control those in standing, growing corn and soybeans. So I think from our main weed species that we're dealing with, winter wheat itself, just because it's when it's growing, it's being a winter crop versus a spring crop, it really provides us some benefits there on the weed control side.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned before, it's really important to consider that for people that have gone away from winter wheat for a while, this is not this is not your grandfather's winter wheat to put it, is one way to put it, because we're achieving some of these 90 to 100 bushel yields in the last few years, where that's not quite something they're used to, I don't think.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this is something that we'll be discussing more as the year progresses, and you can learn more in upcoming Nebraska Farmer print and web articles. Also, be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and thank you for listening to the Nebraska Notebook.